Hello and welcome to Badger Talks Quick Picks, which bring exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Aileen Aman from Lombard, Illinois. I'm a sophomore majoring in political science. I'm pleased to introduce Jon Pevehouse, Mary Herman Rubinstein, Professor of Political Science and Public Policy. Today, Jon will speak on how most major candidates for office this cycle agree on one thing. The U.S. needs to do more to lessen our dependence on China for trade. Both Republicans and Democrats blame China for job losses, intellectual property theft, failing to keep international commitments, and undermining the global trade regime. Are there significant differences among the candidates as to their preferred policies? And no matter who wins, what will trade policy look like in the coming decade? Jon is a professor of political science whose research examines how domestic political debates create pressures to change foreign policy. His work has focused on trade policy, international human rights, and international organizations. Recently, he published a co-authored paper on how Americans view trade policy with different trade partners, finding that partnerships where democracies generate more support for trade deals. Please welcome Jon Pevehouse.
Great. Thanks so much, Ada. Thanks for the introduction. And thank you for having me on Badger Talks. So today, as Ada said, I want to talk a little bit about trade and how trade policy has been working itself or is going to work itself into the election, the 2024 U.S. presidential election, and also how trade policy in general has kind of evolved over the last few years and where it's likely to go in the future. So as I just said, some of my research is on what the U.S. public thinks about trade. Now, if you remember back to the 2016 presidential election, there were a lot of debates between Trump and Clinton about things like NAFTA, Trump calling it the worst deal ever, warning against going into the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a giant trade deal with a number of American allies in the Pacific. And Clinton, who initially supported the TPP, eventually backed off of that and said, nope, if I get elected, we're not going to do that. Then Trump comes into office, Trump wins that election, immediately starts talking about putting tariffs on Chinese goods. And so then proceeded between, 2018 and 2020 to increase tariffs on imports into the United States from China, but from other countries as well, including some of our allies in Europe. And there's a lot of debate and controversy around that. Trump renegotiated NAFTA, which is now called the U.S. Canada-Mexico Free Trade Deal, the USMCA. And then Biden gets elected in 2020. And there was some discussion in 2020 about tariffs in that election, in the previous election, but not as much. And in fact, Biden criticized Trump's tariffs quite significantly. And then enter some of my research. So what some of my research showed, which was kind of fielded around, the experiments were fielded between 2020, 2022. We were basically doing surveys and survey experiments of Americans where we would say, like, what do you think about free trade? Do you like free trade? Should we be trading more or less? And it turns out most Americans, in theory, like free trade. They like the idea of open trade. They like the idea of open markets. But then when you start adding a few specifics to it, what our research found was that can vary a lot. If you talk about trade with traditional allies, they seem to like that more. Trade with China, they seem to like a lot less. But trade with other kind of more nebulous countries, if you don't mention a country name, you just say, what about a country that has good human rights or bad human rights? Or what about other types of countries that are, say, democratic or not democratic? So it turns out Americans favor trade with countries that respect human rights, have democratic systems, free elections, etc. Of course, they could be thinking about China versus Germany or, France versus Saudi Arabia. And so that's entirely possible. We think they're thinking quite a bit about China in our research. And so thinking about that is what I want to talk a little bit more about, which is in the current presidential election, 2024. You honestly haven't heard a lot. You didn't hear much from Biden. You're not hearing a lot from Harris, nor are you hearing that much from Trump on trade policy. That's kind of dropped off the radar a little bit. And I think one reason, and Ada mentioned this in her introduction, is I think this is one of the places where the parties kind of agree. So Biden takes power in 2020 and basically leaves almost all of Trump's tariffs as is, especially on China. So you've got this kind of high rate of tariffs on a lot of goods coming from China. And in fact, Biden, over the course of the last 4 years, has doubled down on this. He's actually increased tariffs on a number of things like electric vehicles coming from China, computer chips coming from China, etc. So what's changed over the last 50 years, if you ask economists or political scientists, is that we thought in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, we thought the sort of era of protectionism and what you might call mercantilism, that is using trade tariffs to build power, to build geopolitical power, to build military power, to build diplomatic power. We thought that era was kind of done. We thought everyone accepted free trade. We thought everyone accepted open markets. And so because of that, Trump really ruffled a lot of feathers when he started putting on these tariffs. But then Biden also ruffled feathers by keeping the tariffs on. Now you've got both parties. No one's talking about taking down these tariffs, right? In fact, Trump's saying he's going to double the tariffs that he put on in his previous administration. And Harris has said that, basically she's happy with the tariffs. We need to keep China in its place, and we need to make sure we're protecting American jobs. This has been a huge shift, again, over the last 40 to 50 years, vis-a-vis American economic policy and global economic policy. So from that perspective, I've not been surprised that there's not been a lot of debate in the current election about this. I think what you will start to see, though, in the run-up to the actual election, say, for example, September, October, is as more economic reports comes out, as things like inflation become more discussed even more, I think you'll see more and more discussion of global economic policy. And here's what I suspect will happen. One reason the Trump tariffs continued under Biden and frankly didn't cause as much concern. Even, when he did this, economists were like, oh, this is going to be a disaster. It's going to be terrible. But a few things happened simultaneously that kind of helped Trump. And I won't say it was luck or whatever, but just some fortuitous exogenous events, let's say. One of the things that happened during Trump's time in office is the dollar got incredibly strong. That is, the dollar became more valuable vis-a-vis other currencies. So as Trump's putting on tariffs against, let's say, China, the dollar is getting stronger against the Chinese currency, the renminbi. So a dollar buys even more Chinese goods than it did in the past. So even though there's a tariff and the goods are more expensive, the value of the dollar is going up. So it helps kind of offset those tariffs. Another thing Trump did is he did a very slow rollout of the tariffs. In other words, it took about 2 years for all the tariffs to kick in. So what did smart firms do around the world, or well, in the United States in particular? They pre-bought. They placed massive orders for supplies in 2018, which then filled their warehouses with the goods at that lower tariff rate. And in that way, they kept prices down on American products. The third thing, and this is the really huge irony of this trade war started by Trump but continued by Biden, was the pandemic, right? The pandemic happens. And the pandemic's effect on prices and on trade and on supply chains so massively outweighed any effect of these tariffs that no one remembered the tariffs were on, in a way, right? We all know how discombobulated the economy became with the onset of that crisis, of the COVID-19 crisis. So as a result, all this trade policy kind of washed out and no one thought about it. But now what's likely to happen, now that we're through COVID, now that supply chains have seemed to return to normal, we're in an era of high inflation, right? What's going to happen? So now the talking point of my prediction is the Democrats are going to start criticizing Trump again on tariffs, especially because he says he wants to raise them even further. And so given our research on kind of the fact that Americans kind of don't necessarily like free trade, they don't seem to mind tariffs and protectionism on non-democracies, non-allies, it's likely that Trump sees this as a way to garner American votes, right? As a way to garner an economic argument and economic support in his attempt to regain the White House. I think what you're going to see on the Democratic side is the argument that, look, the COVID crisis is over. We're back to a more normal international economy. We have high inflation. If he puts these additional tariffs on goods, you see inflation going even higher. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, which is sort of a very centrist, if not slightly center-right political think tank in Washington, has suggested that further increases in tariffs, no matter who puts them on, further increases in tariffs will cost American consumers in their pocketbook, right? Prices will go up even more, which at a time of high inflation could be incredibly dangerous. So you're going to start seeing these talking points bandied about by both candidates. Most likely Trump defending the tariffs. Trump's line, by the way, is that other countries pay these tariffs. I will just say with my social science, political economy hat on, that's not true. other countries do not pay these tariffs unless individual firms like Walmart or Apple, et cetera, can force their suppliers in China to take on the cost of those tariffs. But those businesses in China or Indonesia or wherever, Vietnam, have no incentive to do this, right? They'll just sell those products to India or to somewhere else. So that's highly, highly unlikely, if not impossible in some cases, right? It is US firms that are paying those tariffs. The question is not whether the foreign firms or US firms pay. US firms are going to pay. The question is, do US firms pass those costs on to consumers? Do they raise the price of goods, right? Or do they just undercut their own bottom line and take slightly less profit? In the first round of Trump tariffs, that's what you saw. Firms, again, because inflation was low at the time, their bottom lines were healthy, rather than pass those increased costs on to consumers, kind of sucked those up themselves. And again, they had time to adjust. They pre-bought at lower prices. The dollar was strong. They had easy ways to offset the cost of the tariffs. These days, they don't necessarily have that. Now, that's a complicated argument. All that I went through, you can't say that in one sentence, right? You can't say that in a 5-second soundbite. This is why, in my opinion, you've seen a little bit less discussion of economics, both because the parties agree China's not good and we need to try to do something economically against China, but also the fact that these arguments are quite complicated. Trump says, oh, the foreign countries pay. It's absolutely not true, but to explain why that's not true takes 3 to 4 minutes, right? No one wants to listen to an economics argument for 3 to 4 minutes in a political debate. So you're going to be back to these one-liners, and I think the one-liners are going to be from Trump, I'm going to raise tariffs, save jobs. I think from Harris is going to be, the tariffs will hurt, they will raise prices on consumers, and it's going to make inflation worse. And then the rest of that will just be sort of the devil's in the details, and do people want to hash that out? So in the end, I think the other final point I would just say quickly is that, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the Republican Party was the political party of free trade, right? It was the Democrats who were the protectionists and constantly wanting to raise tariffs, especially in Congress. And in fact, the president was pretty consistently, both Republican and Democratic presidents were pretty consistently telling Congress, no, you can't raise tariffs. Fast forward 30 years, I think Donald Trump has really shifted where the party is at, in part because kind of working class blue collar voters have shifted a bit from the Democrats to the Republicans. And with them have come some of these preferences for higher levels of tariffs, protectionism to save jobs, especially those union workers who now oftentimes will support Trump and the Republican Party. The Democrats, on the other side, starting with the Clinton administration, have become much more pro-free trade. Now, what makes all this more complicated is that when you think about, okay, well, who's a part of both parties, what workers, what firms, et cetera, it's that with global supply chains, right? 50 years ago, you thought about trade being, well, someone builds a car in Japan and they put it on a boat and it comes to the United States. Someone makes a shirt in Vietnam and they put it on a boat and it comes to the United States. That's not the way the global economy works anymore, for the most part, right? It is supply chains. Part of a good's made here, part of a good's made somewhere else, part of a good's made in a fifth country, and then eventually it makes its way to the United States, where probably some more value added is accomplished, right? So people are intermediate suppliers, as we would say, or they're in the middle of the supply chain. Tariffs are complicated for those folks, right? Because on one hand, let's say you're an American firm making chalkboards. You may be making the chalkboards here, and selling them here. So you want high tariffs on chalkboards, right? Because you want to keep Chinese chalkboards out of the US market. But all your supplies going into making the chalkboard are coming from China, right? And so you don't want tariffs on those goods, right? So as a firm, as a company, how do you think about that? And that's what's made trade more complicated for the parties. So it's made trade more complicated, trade preferences more complicated for firms, both in the United States and in places like Canada and Mexico. And so trade has become this very fast-moving, kind of shifting sands political issue over time. So, but in the end, again, based on our research, and I think what you're seeing in the global economy right now, there's going to be, in the coming few weeks of the 2024 presidential election, a lot more discussion of these economic issues, where you have, again, no one saying we need to be nice and trade more with China. No one's saying, let's get rid of the tariffs. The question is going to be, how much do we raise the tariffs? Do we raise them maybe a little bit with Harris, or do we raise them a lot? with Trump. So again, thanks for listening, and please feel free to reach out. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and public policy, and we're here to inform you all and fulfill the Wisconsin idea of informing the public. And it's great talking with you. Thanks.